can be said with reasonable confidence based on the documented record is this. The mirrors Fenwick worked on were old. They were unusually large. They were made with a technique that contained at minimum one undocumented component. They were housed in buildings whose own origins are, to anyone who examines them carefully, difficult to square with the official historical timeline. They were maintained at substantial cost by institutional administrators who had access to cheaper alternatives. And when Elias Fenwick, the last practicing specialist in the old technique, described what he found in these mirrors, he described something he could not account for by his training. And then he stopped working. He was 44 years old in 1875. He lived until 1903. He appears in Bristol City records as a resident throughout that period. He paid his rates. He appeared in census records. He had children and eventually grandchildren. By all accounts, he lived quietly and without apparent distress. But he never took another commission. He never trained an apprentice in the old technique. He turned away every inquiry, and according to a brief obituary published in a Bristol trade journal in 1903, he had in his later years declined even to discuss his former profession with visitors. The obituary, which was short and perfunctory in the way of trade journal obituaries, noted that Fenwick had been considered in his prime the leading practitioner of traditional mirror silvering in England, and expressed mild puzzlement that a craftsman of such evident skill had withdrawn so completely from his trade at the relatively young age of 44. It attributed his retirement to unspecified personal reasons and moved on. No one, at the time, appears to have pressed the question. But the question is there. Why does a man with a unique and valuable skill, a man at the height of his abilities, a man with more work than he can accept, walk away from that skill entirely and never speak of it again? The charitable reading is personal. A health concern, a family situation, a loss of appetite for the work after decades of it. These are all plausible. The less charitable reading is that Fenwick saw something in those mirrors that he did not want to see again, and did not want to be in a position where he might be asked to see it. The letter to his brother in 1869, written before the final commission that seems to have preceded his retirement by approximately 5 years, already shows a man unsettled by his work in a way that goes beyond professional complexity. The private memorandum from the early 1880s, written after his retirement, shows a man who has thought carefully about what he witnessed and arrived at conclusions he chose to record but not to share. There is a pattern here that goes beyond Fenwick, and it is worth pausing to examine it, because it appears with enough consistency across different crafts and different countries in the second half of the 19th century to deserve more attention than it has received. Across multiple skilled trades associated with the maintenance and restoration of pre-industrial objects, the same basic sequence unfolds in the decades between 1850 and 1890. A new industrial method renders the old technique economically obsolete. The transition happens quickly, within a decade in most cases. The small number of remaining practitioners of the old method retire or shift to other work. No systematic effort is made to document the old technique before the last practitioners are gone, and within a generation the knowledge is functionally extinct. This pattern is not in itself suspicious. It is entirely consistent with how industrial transitions work. New techniques displace old ones. Knowledge that is no longer economically useful is not preserved. This is the normal operation of market-driven craft evolution. But the Tartaria researchers point to something specific about this particular transition, the transition away from mercury amalgam mirror backing in the 1870s that distinguishes it from the normal pattern of craft obsolescence. In most craft transitions, the old method continues to be practiced at the artisanal level even after industrial methods have taken over at scale. Handmade furniture continued to be made after factory furniture dominated the market. Hand-blown glass continued to be produced after pressed glass became the norm. The artisanal tradition survives the industrial transition, diminished but intact, because there is always a small market for the qualities that only the old method can produce. With mercury amalgam silvering, this did not happen. The craft did not persist at the artisanal level. The last practitioners retired in a remarkably short window, and none of them trained successors. The knowledge did not survive in any workshop, any trade school, any guild record, any systematic documentation effort. It simply stopped. The question the Tartaria researchers ask is whether this was accident or design, whether the unusually complete disappearance of this specific body of technical knowledge was the result of normal market forces or the result of a decision by someone with the authority and the motivation to ensure that no one with Elias Fenwick's training and Elias Fenwick's observational capabilities would ever again be in a position to examine those mirrors and report on what they found. There is no direct evidence for deliberate suppression. There is no document, no instruction, no policy. What there is the pattern itself, which is more complete than chance would predict, and which aligns with what the Tartaria hypothesis would expect if the institutional holders of those buildings understood what was in them and preferred that the wider world did not. He knew something. He chose not to continue. And the chain of knowledge he carried, the technical and observational knowledge of a lineage of mirror workers that stretched back at least to the late 1600s, and possibly much further, died with him. Because here is the final piece. When Elias Fenwick retired in 1875, he was not simply the last of his family to practice the trade. He was, as best the surviving historical record can determine, one of the last practitioners anywhere in England of the full mercury amalgam technique, at the level required to work on the institutional scale pieces. The shift to chemical silvering had been rapid and comprehensive. The training infrastructure for the old method had effectively collapsed within a decade of the commercial transition. There were older practitioners who remembered the technique but had long since retired. There were a handful of younger craftsmen who had learned it partially, but not completely. Fenwick was the last one who had been trained in the full tradition, who had apprenticed under a master who himself had apprenticed under a master, going back through the generations to a time before industrial manufacturing, before the systematic compartmentalization of craft knowledge, before the period in which, if the Tartaria hypothesis is correct, the civilization that produced those mirrors was erased from history. When he stopped taking orders, that lineage ended. Not with a catastrophe, not with a fire or a plague or a war, with a quiet decision by one man to put down his tools and say nothing more. The mirrors he worked on are still in some of those buildings, many of them. You can go to certain grand civic halls in England, to certain institutional buildings, to certain hotels that have maintained their original fixtures across multiple centuries of operation, and you can stand in front of mirrors that Elias Fenwick's hands touched. Mirrors whose backing layer contains a composition that no living craftsman understands. Mirrors that were already old when the buildings that housed them were officially constructed. You will not be able to see what Fenwick saw in them. You do not have his training, his eye, his understanding of what the amalgam should look like versus what it actually looks like. You cannot read the surface the way he could, but you can stand there and look. And if the light is right, and you are patient, and you let your eyes relax and soften rather than focus, you may notice something in the reflection that is slightly different from what you expected. Not supernatural, not impossible, just different, a depth that seems slightly too deep, a warmth in the colour that the room's light does not fully account for, a quality in the image of yourself that feels for just a moment less like a reflection and more like a recording. And you can ask yourself, what was this made to do, and by whom, and where did that knowledge go? Those questions do not have comfortable answers. The official history does not have answers for them at all. The Tartaria hypothesis has answers, but they require accepting premises that most people have been trained very deliberately to dismiss. What can be said without hypothesis, without speculation, grounded in the documented record is this. There was a civilization, or a series of civilizations, whose material culture produced objects that do not fit neatly into the history we have been given. Some of those objects survived. Some were maintained by institutions that understood their value in ways that have never been publicly explained. And the last of the craftsmen who could read those objects with trained hands and trained eyes made a deliberate choice in 1875 to take what he knew out of circulation. He was 44 years old. He had 30 more years of life ahead of him. He could have trained someone. He could have written down the full technical account of what he knew. He could have spoken. He chose not to. And the mirrors kept their secrets. They are keeping them still. The thread you just followed goes deeper than one silversmith, deeper than one city,